This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today's topic is near and dear to the hearts of us at Texas Tech, higher education. First, we'll explore the history and early origins of higher education in the United States. How much of the early growth of higher ed was due to laissez-faire policies? And how was early higher education shaped by government interventions? Then we'll take a hard look at higher education today and the trajectory for its future. My first guest is Dr. Daniel Bennett. Dr. Bennett is Assistant Professor of Economics at Patrick Henry College and has written numerous journal articles and policy studies on higher education. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So let's start at the beginning. Harvard, 1636, first college founded in the United States. John Harvard makes a donation and a college is started. Sounds like a relatively benign, not free market, but free liberty style founding of higher education in the United States. But you're kind of skeptical of that.
Well, Harvard is a very interesting case. It's named after the first benefactor, John Harvard, who actually made a donation. And there's an interesting story behind that donation. There's some mystery surrounding it. He supposedly made a deathbed bequest, not witnessed by a whole lot of other people. He granted 780 British pounds at the time to the college. Records have trouble finding that only about half of that money actually is recorded as being received. So if you look at it that way, he bequested about 375 pounds, whereas the college was founded with a charter from the Massachusetts Bay Colony legislature. They actually gave 400 pounds for the founding of the college in 1636. So really, half of its kind of startup funds came from the government, half of it came from John Harvard, who the college bears his namesake.
And it came with permission from the government to be a college. You needed their permission?
Exactly. So you could think of it as kind of being, they had permission from the government in a sense. They had a monopoly privilege to operate in the colony, and the colonial government would actually protect the college from competition over the next 200 years, as well as provide it with numerous subsidies. Scholars have estimated that at least 50% of their annual revenues came from subsidies from taxing otherwise productive economic activities in the state. They got subsidies from tolls that were collected on the bridge across the Charles River. There was a ferry that ran people across the river, and so they got a portion of those subsidies, and later a bank tax, and they got a big portion of the subsidies on the bank from the banks.
So before we explore kind of other universities and whether this was a unique kind of crony arrangement with Harvard, what would be your definition of something that looks like a free market in early higher education? What would make it more government dominated versus market?
Yeah, so I kind of think about a free market in higher education as consisting of three kind of primary criteria. One is they should have property rights. Okay, so the people that start the college should be able to do with their property as they wish. It should be protected from the aggression of others. They should have some institutional autonomy in making their decisions. Second criteria should be that they should be private in terms of both the sources of the funding that they receive as well as in the decisions that they make. They should be free from political influence. In terms of the funding, that doesn't necessarily have to come from paying customers, given what we know about higher education being, somewhat having some spillover effects, right? But all that excludes is money from the government. They could get money from tuition payments or grants made for voluntary contributions. So it lends itself to a variety of institutional arrangements. And the third one would be, we should see higher ed subject to the same kind of competitive forces that we see in other market sectors. So we should see this sector being free kind of from political barriers to entry. So we should see entry into the market. We should also see exit from the market, so we shouldn't have barriers to exit. And it's interesting to look at the history, how governments bailed out colleges, gave them loans, forgave their loans. And so these three factors we would kind of like to see to encompass a free market.
Okay, well that sounds reasonable. How does early colonial higher education stack up in that regard then? It doesn't sound like Harvard does particularly well, but how about the rest?
Yeah, so the first three colleges, you've got Harvard, the second college founded in the late 1600s, William and Mary, third college, Princeton University. And so you look at it, you see some elements of the market, but you also see some elements that kind of don't fit within this framework. As I mentioned earlier, Harvard was highly subsidized. William and Mary was very highly subsidized. They got their charter from the Queen Mary of England in 1691, came with a package of what we might call economic rents. They got £2,000 startup capital from what's called quit rents. I don't know if you're familiar with that is.
I'm not familiar with quit rents.
A quit rent is essentially a payment made by a freeholder for his granting to not have to be an indentured servant, right? So granting people the right to not be slaves. Essentially, they had to make a payment to the government, and that government payment was then given to the College of William and Mary. So they got £2,000 in quit rents. They got 20,000 acres of land to do what they wanted with. They also William and Mary got the rights to survey land and make money off of surveying land that didn't really belong to them.
So they had a lot of special privileges too.
A lot of special privileges.
Also a prohibition on competition?
For a long time, they basically had a monopoly, and there was no entry into the market in Virginia.
And this was common in most of the original 13 colonies?
Exactly.
Prior to the Revolution?
Prior to the Revolution, there was nine colleges founded during the colonial era, and the only colony that had two was New Jersey. Queens College, which would later become Rutgers, after trying to get the right to operate in Massachusetts, which Harvard effectively blocked them from gaining entry in that market. They later were able to get it in New Jersey, even after New Jersey had granted a charter to what is now Princeton University to operate there.
So then we get the Revolution, but then the early 19th century, actually, we see a explosion of colleges, which is really different because in the colonial period, almost nobody went to college, right?
Yeah.
There was very few people who went. But then we see I guess it must be a surge in demand and a market satisfying it in the early 19th century, right?
Perhaps. You're exactly right. The estimates that I've seen suggest that less than 1 in 1,000 young people actually went to a college during the colonial period. Perhaps there's an increase in demand following the founding of the United States and the Constitution. We see a lot of kind of the church denominations wanting to kind of start institutions of higher learning to train up clergymen and public officials.
So it wasn't necessarily consumer demand of students wanting to pay tuition, but churches and others demanding the training of people and subsidizing it.
Exactly. So you see the churches, you see different denominations, religions that are, want to train people in a certain classical type of education so that the leaders in that day of the church, as well as the civic organizations and the public administration, are going to be of their kind of religious kind of same following, which, that's okay.
This doesn't seem anti-market to me.
Right.
Seems like it's just a different set of demanders.
Yeah, and so and I think Henry Manny, who passed this last year, has kind of written about this and how that really lends itself, the early denominational colleges really lends itself to the creation of nonprofit organizations because, some of the benefit is being derived not from the students themselves, but also to these organizations that want to see, the clergy and the public officials following in kind of their religious order.
So obviously during this period, the grants of monopoly privilege by the governments must have disappeared for the colleges to be able to grow so many new ones. Were they still subsidized? Was some of this growth subsidized?
A lot of it was. An important Supreme Court case was in 1819. Dartmouth College was facing a battle with its local government, which basically they're like, we're subsidizing you, we should have control over what you're doing. A big kind of political legal battle ensues. Eventually they go to basically the state Supreme Court. They rule in favor of the government. They appeal, they go to the United States Supreme Court. Supreme Court rules in favor of the college, saying what Dartmouth had was a contract with the Queen of England to kind of operate this college. the United States Article 1, Section 10 says that the government can't forbid or can't violate these contracts, gives basically Dartmouth property rights and says the government, you can't take this property right. It's a lot of scholars believe that this kind of sets the impetus for the founding a bunch of these colleges.
So kind of the fallout from this afterwards is the establishment that even if the government's subsidizing a private university, they can't then subsequently control it. And we start seeing the founding of then public universities that the government can control afterwards, right?
Yeah, and so that's the scholars believe that this kind of provides not only an impetus for the founding of a number of private colleges, but this also gives governments an incentive if they want to control the college that they're subsidizing, an incentive to kind of create public universities.
So we have about a minute or so left here. Some people would look at this and say, well, there was an explosion in higher ed in the early 19th century. We've got public and private institutions. We've got some subsidies to private institutions from public. Well, what's wrong with this? We've got higher ed today that's really, high quality in the United States. Isn't this, a good thing?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a normative evaluation, and I'm definitely not saying that, government doesn't play any role in financing education. There's certainly good arguments for that as well as good arguments against that. But what we see from the founding of the first colonial colleges up through the antebellum rise of college is that we really are creating a foundation for the behavior of college officials to be seeking protection and subsidization through the government rather than being entrepreneurial and kind of seeking to provide a product that students demand and they're willing to pay for. And this really has a long-term effect on kind of the political economy landscape that we see in higher education that exists up until today, where we see colleges, doing extensive rent seeking and relying upon governments to kind of pay their bills.
Well, that's a good segue. Thank you for being with us, because that's what we're going to talk about next. Up next, is higher education a bubble industry like housing recently was? Stick around to find out.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Lance Nail. Dr. Nail is a professor of finance here at Texas Tech University and has done some work on higher education. Lance, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate the invitation.
So on the first half of the show, we talked about kind of the origins of higher ed in the United States and the mix between private and government funding then. And I think people are a lot more interested in what's going on in higher education today, in particular, the cost. Maybe could you just put that in perspective for us to start of what's happened over the last 10, 20 years for the cost of higher ed in the United States?
Sure. Actually, if you look at the last 30 years, it's been about a 500% increase.
500%?
500%. It's about 3 times the rate of inflation, a little over 3 times the rate. So it's really gone from a discussion among higher ed circles into more of a public policy discussion that we're taking on. Now, the average cost of a 4-year public education, including housing, tuition, fees, is approaching $30,000 a year.
Wow.
So you're talking about a $120,000 investment in a 4-year college degree now.
So why do you think the cost has gone up so much?
There's a lot of debate. How much of that is instructional costs that are driving that? How much is non-instructional costs? I think most people have concluded it's the non-instructional costs that are driving that. So it's a lot of the cost associated with enhanced accreditation, the things we have to do with that, a lot more administration that goes into it. We hear the term administrative bloat used a lot. And you have a lot of facilities, a lot of the ancillaries now, the cost of living in residence halls, the cost of the meal plans, all these things have started adding up incrementally over time until they've made a pretty big difference.
Yeah, so that all makes sense to me too, but usually, if some business just starts jacking up its costs, they lose their customers and you don't get to increase 500%. There's got to be something going on the demand side here too.
We do see the demand side. The thing that's come out and you've seen a lot of comparisons with, is there a higher ed bubble versus the housing bubble that we saw in 07, 08 that burst. Part of the difference is that there's still a positive return on investment in education. It's narrowed. And I think that's the discussion that's taking place now, is that lifetime earnings tend to be on average about $1 million over the lifetime of a person with a college degree versus one who doesn't. Cost is probably, you roll in, say $120,000 is the cost of a 4-year degree. The opportunity cost of giving up a job for 4 years is going to add some of that. So you're talking about a $200,000 investment for still $1 million of incremental lifetime earnings. There's still a payoff to it, but the payoff has been narrowed somewhat.
Yeah, and I have to imagine that the payoff varies tremendously by degree. Your degree in underwater basket weaving versus finance, say.
With finance, I would be a little biased as a finance professor, but yes, you see a lot of variance. And I think that's another part of the discussion that's taking place now in the higher ed circles and the public policy circles is you have to have a passion for what you study or you won't be successful. But the other side is you have to make a living wage to be successful as well. And I think there's a blend of finding the passion that you have, but making sure that you make the right decision. You know, the STEM fields certainly have been very successful in placing the students. And if you look at the top 10 highest paying career paths the last several years, engineering, computer science, business, they've all been very strong. God help them, we need our social workers, we need an educated workforce helping in those areas, but you've got to make an informed decision going into that, realizing that you probably aren't going to make a fortune over your lifetime.
Yeah. Now, of course, while the cost has gone up a lot, it's not the student and their family who always necessarily pays it, though. Federal subsidies to higher education, both through public institutions and through the grants that then go to private institutions, have to play a role in paying for all this, and must explain some of why consumers don't walk away when cost goes up, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that does play a part into it. I think the College Board came out and said that the average cost of a 4-year degree of tuition and fees is about $9,500 a year now. But through financial aid, subsidies, grants, everything else that goes through, the average family pays a little less than $4,000 of that cost. So absolutely.
Yeah. So let's get back to this bubble aspect of it, particularly since I got a finance guy on here with me. It always strikes me as just wrong-headed when people say it's a higher ed bubble. To me, a bubble implies something that's irrationally trading beyond a fundamental value that must self-correct. Mm-hmm. Do you see that in higher ed? I mean, you've talked about the return for some students, but is there anything that spells that this, costs have gone up 500%? It might be that that's not continuable to keep going up at that rate,
right?
But it doesn't say it has to recorrect, does it?
No, I think you're absolutely right. We've seen that. I know Vetter is one of the economists who keeps using that term, the higher ed bubble. If you look at, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the return on investment is still positive for most college degrees. And so a bubble to me is if you were looking at financial assets, stocks, bonds, and certainly the housing market, you didn't have that underlying base that you have with your investment in yourself and your education. So to me, a bubble means a mispricing. I don't think that mispricing exists.
Right. What do you think about this too? Sometimes people will say, people earning a particular type of degree where the ROI just isn't there, says it doesn't make sense. To me, we live in a wealthier society, and guys like Vetter complain about the lazy river and the rock climbing walls at university, but as we're wealthier, maybe some people just consume more leisure and bundle it with studying something that's interesting to them but doesn't have financial rewards, and a little paddling down the lazy river.
Jeff Selingo is one of the thought leaders in this area, and Selingo's written a book called College Unbound, where he talks about these very issues. And he's going to be more aligned with what Vetter is saying. But a lot of what people are saying on the other side is it's a consumer perspective, that we're here to develop we're here for our students to develop as individuals. And it's not that the education is the primary driver of what that is supposed to be for the collegiate experience, but it should be broader than that. I think the bigger issue that's come in with a lot of people is that, for the upper middle class, that's not an issue. Where it becomes an issue is for the accessibility of those at the lower socioeconomic scale. Maybe you can't afford to be in those residence halls. Maybe you can't afford those dining plans. Do we have adequate financial aid for that group? I think that's the bigger concern.
Well, actually, now this is starting to scratch me as a free market guy here. My big concern on this would be, I'm all for lazy rivers and luxurious dining plans if the student and their family's paying for it. If we're going to make some sort of argument for higher ed funding through the government, it can't be about lazy rivers and dining plans, can it?
Shouldn't be. Absolutely, it shouldn't be. And in fact, that's sort of what Salingo has been saying, is that, and that's why he uses that catchy term, college unbound, because he wants to unbind all these services that are rolled in, so that if you don't want the lazy river, if you don't want the rock climbing wall, if you don't want the all-you-can-eat buffets at midnight, then you shouldn't have to pay for those. You should be able to pay just for your educational, just the education.
Now, in the recent presidential election, we had, well, actually, as always, all sorts of insane promises from lots of candidates. But one that came up was that we want to have free college education. Whenever, as an economist, I hear the word free something, a little piece of my soul dies. But what does this mean in the context of college? Is it even feasible?
No, it's not feasible. I go back to the same economic philosophy. It's the tragedy of the commons. If you don't have skin in the game, you're not going to fully value it and respect it. That doesn't mean that we need to. I don't have a problem with some subsidies that allow those from the lower socioeconomic groups to find their way to college with some help and some assistance. But promising everyone a free college, certainly for those who have the wealth and the ability to pay for it, that should not be a free good.
So I agree completely. Now, you mentioned the people from the lower socioeconomic groups here and access to it. One thing that we've seen happening over the last decade in particular is a ballooning of student loan debt. So people can get access to higher education from other groups because they can get federally funded student loans or other private student loans, but they have this massive debt afterwards. How much of a problem is that now?
Well, that's where the higher ed bubble discussion comes in. And so I gave a talk at the Lubbock Economics Council that I think you saw about 1.5 years ago. And at that time, we had just topped $1 trillion in student loan debt outstanding. Since that time, that's been about 1.5 years ago, we're at 1.2 trillion now. So we've grown 20% in student debt outstanding in less than 2 years. That's pretty alarming. And now we have about 42 million people who have student loans. Now, there's good and there's bad to that. If you really drill down into the Federal Reserve data that is presented on that, what you find is that the biggest loans outstanding are for students who are graduates of graduate programs in professional fields. Law school, medical school, and MBA programs. They tend to have the highest income levels. So there tends to be a correlation between the amount of debt outstanding. That's I guess the part that doesn't concern me so much. At the lower end though, you see you are seeing higher and higher levels of student debt outstanding for those at the lower end as well. That is a concern.
This seems to me something that the market process might eventually correct here. If students who make investments in human capital that are worth it can pay off their loans later, those who can't get themselves into trouble, and maybe we'll stop having people take out so many loans for career paths that won't pay off.
Well, I think transparency is what it comes down to. I think as long as you're fully informed when you make the decision and you take out a student loan and you realize that you may not go down a career path with this major where you're going to accumulate a great deal of wealth, as long as you've made that fully informed decision, then you know what you've done. So to me, I think the bigger issue is, do we inform students? Do they know when they sign up for a particular major what the outcomes are? You may very well be happy with a career path that doesn't lead you to a great deal of wealth, and you're very happy and you take out student loans. That's fine. The Department of Education went down a path where they were trying to do this. They had the right idea, but the implementation was wrong. And they brought out some information on different colleges, different career tracks. Unfortunately, the information was a little bit more nebulous than we would have cared for, but that's what we need.
So actually, in the last few seconds here then, just in addition to greater transparency, what other reforms do you think would help make higher education function better?
Well, we always need to look internally, and we need to make ourselves more efficient to serve our customers, our students better. We also, a lot of legislators are now looking at a lot of what the forces from the outside are from the accrediting boards and what's being required there. We don't know if that's going to drive any changes there, but that may be something else we look at in the future.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today, Lance.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
Higher education provides a valuable service to society. And like many industries in our economy, it functions on a mix of market signals and government regulations and interference. As we learned on today's show, This has been true since the founding of our country in early colonial times. I'm sure, like many industries, higher education could perform more efficiently and provide better services. And I suspect if it responded more to market forces and less to government regulation, it would do a better job of that. Thanks for watching. See you next time.